Empezar con esta presentación del informe sobre gas de la Agencia Internacional. Vamos a hacerlo en inglés. I'm trying to switch to English because Costanza, she's Italian, but she don't understand Spanish, she said. Okay, thank you for coming to everybody. This is the fourth medium-term report we are presenting now. We have presented in January the coal medium-term report. We have presented the oil, we have presented the renewables energy, and now we are presenting the gas forecast for the future. And we have here the senior analyst in the International Energy Agency, Costanza Jacazio, to present that and to analyze the LNG markets, the prices, all this in the medium term perspective of the International Energy Agency. As you know, these reports forecast for 5 years. All of these are the 5 years. The report that we presented last week is the energy technology, and this is different. This is like an outlook for the future. In this case, this is a report which are trying to forecast for the next 5 years in the gas market. Well, this is I'm trying to present Costanza. It's a pleasure of having her here, and he has been working in the energy agency since last year or the year before. She's Italian, I just said before. She worked before in Fortune, a utility in the north of Europe, in Finland, and she worked in the banking sector too, in the financial sector before. She is the senior analyst in the coal and this area, in the gas market, and she's responsible for this medium-term report. The floor is yours, Costanza. After this, we can have a Q&A section, and they can ask you whatever, okay?
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and first of all, thank you very much for having me here, and thank you to all of you for coming. I will spend the next half an hour or so to try to summarize the key messages that emerge from the analysis that we carried out in the report. And of course, it will be very interesting to hear your comments and questions afterwards. So the first key message.
This one, on the right hand side.
Thank you. Thank you. A first key message is that we do expect global gas demand growth to weaken substantially in the next 5 years. This bar here shows the rate of growth, the average annual rate of growth between 2009 and 2015. Global gas demand grew by 2.5% annually on average. Between 2015 and 2021, we expect growth to drop to 1.5% annually on average. Of course, somebody could argue that the choice of 29 as a base year might amplify the strength of the past 5 years, but if we take the 10 years instead, global demand growth on average still grew at an annual pace of 2.2%. So clearly there is a weakening unfolding. What is really behind this weakening? I think it's important to notice that part of the weakness is not gas-specific, but relates to broader developments across the energy complex, and in particular to the substantial deceleration in primary energy demand growth, which is linked to a number of structural and cyclical factors: the economic and the energy transformation of China, the very sharp deceleration in economic activity in energy-intensive economies such as Russia and the Middle East, which tend to lower the energy intensity of the world economy, and the continued decoupling between electricity demand and economic activity in advanced economies. So if we put all this together, this means that yes, gas demand growth slows, but oil and coal demand also weaken. So by 2021, we still expect gas to maintain its market share in the energy mix because of the simultaneous deceleration in growth from other fossil fuels as well. On the other hand, there are factors which affect the outlook for demand, for gas demand specifically, particularly in the power sector, where gas continue to face very tough competition from very low coal prices on the one hand, and continued strong deployment of renewables on the other. And so, reversing a very long-standing trend, we do expect demand in the power sector to grow more slowly than total gas demand. And this is quite a change compared to what historically has occurred, where the power sector has really driven the strength of global gas demand growth. And so far, therefore, we don't really expect lower fossil fuel prices to be able to offset many of these developments. Now, we do take a regional view, and we look at what changes are unfolding in different countries. I think it's interesting to plot the total incremental gas demand growth across different major consuming countries or regions between the previous period, so 2009-2015, versus 2015-2021. And I think there are a number of things that might be of interest to highlight. The first is the consolidation of China really as a driver of global demand growth. And I think some of you might actually think that forecast might look a little bit optimistic in consideration of the very sharp deceleration that we did observe in Chinese gas demand in 2015, when growth was around 4% per year, which was a weaker growth rate since 1998. Now, why do we expect that recovery to occur? I think it's due to a number of different reasons. The first one is that we do believe that a substantial amount of the weakness in 2015 in Chinese demand was temporary and due to the very slow adjustments in domestic gas prices in China to the fall in international benchmarks. So gas prices in China were adjusted significantly just in November 2015, while oil prices in China got adjusted very quickly to the steep fall in international oil prices. This basically meant that gas in China lost competition versus oil in the industrial sector, predominantly in the petrochemical and chemical sectors, where not surprisingly LPG demand skyrocketed. So we do think that with the bottoming out of oil prices and with the sharp adjustments in domestic gas prices that was implemented at the very end of 2015, some of those effects will actually reverse. So we expect gas demand in China to start strengthening again and to gain back some competitive ground versus oil demand. At the same time, it's undeniable that China is facing a structural slowdown in heavy industry, and the industrial activity is decelerating. So that process will be negative for gas demand, but at the same time, we do expect an acceleration in the level of coal to gas substitution in the industrial sector and the residential sector. So that coal to gas substitution, we think, will offset some of the weakness in gas consumption in the industrial sector, which is actually triggered by the structural transformation of the Chinese economy towards a more service-oriented model. So we expect on average Chinese demand growth of 9% per year between 2015 and 2021. The other, for me, striking takeaway of that picture is a substantial slowdown in U.S. gas demand growth. Now, you can see from the picture that between 2009 and 2015, U.S. gas consumption increased by substantially more than 100 BCM. Now we expect a growth of around 25 BCM. The key reason of the slowdown is the expectation for stagnation in the power sector. Why is that happening? Why do we forecast that? Now, in a development that echoes the experience of Europe, we now expect also in the US a flattening in electricity generation growth to be sort of more than offset by strong growth in renewable generation. So what this means is that you're going to have relatively small increases in total electricity demand and relatively strong increases in generation from low carbon sources, which will compress the amount left for thermal generation. So we expect actually thermal generation to decline at the range of 100-110 terawatt hours, which is a substantial change from the previous 5 years where actually thermal generation was increasing. Now, because of the substantial increase in gas-fired consumption in 2015 due to the incredibly low gas prices, a very high level of coal-to-gas switching that took place in 2015, we don't think there is so much more space left for gas to steal ground to coal from a pure price based reasons. So of course, because coal capacity will retire in the US, there will be some space left for gas, but not so much due to the economics of gas to coal switching, which have indeed really helped the very strong increase in gas consumption in the United States over the previous 5 years. So gas consumption in the United States will increase because, of course, we're going to see increase in the transportation and industrial sectors, but not very much in the power sector. And I would say, if anything, I think the forecasts are skewed to the downside. So there is the risk for gas demand in power sector to actually decline rather than stagnating. Now, in Europe, we expect stabilization of demand, a small increase, around 10 BCM, which is, of course, a substantial improvement compared to the experience of the past 5 years. And that is basically driven by flat electricity generation growth, but substantial, meaningful, let's say, closures of coal-fired capacity and the beginning of closure of nuclear capacity, which will leave space for gas to increase somewhat. Also, a good chunk of the increase is expected to occur in the UK, which, because of the presence of the carbon price floor, the economics of gas to coal are actually looking much better than they did in the past. Even so, by 2021, we still expect gas consumption in the European Union to be 13% below the level of 2007. So yes, it's a small recovery, but it's not going to bring us back to the level where we were almost 10 years ago. Japan and Korea, very quickly, but I think this is very important when we're going to discuss trade. We do expect demand from these two countries combined to actually contract. And I think, of course, a good chunk of that is linked to our assumptions on the return on nuclear capacity in Japan, where we do run with the assumption of 15 gigawatt to be back by 2021. But even in the absence of such a, I would say, relatively positive assumption on the return of nuclear, it's very likely that the demand in Japan has actually peaked. So even without strong assumptions on nuclear capacity, the contribution of Korea and Japan together to the global demand picture will be substantially weaker in the next 5 years compared to what was the case in the previous 5. So what about production then? Here shows, this picture here shows the increases in production between 2009 and 2015, and this second set of bars show the expectation for 2015 to 2021. I think there is a clear trend of a move away from production growth across a number of established exporters, primarily Qatar, Russia, and ASEAN countries, towards Australia and the US. Now, Qatar, Russia, and ASEAN production growth combined accounted for roughly 30% of the global increase in production between 2009 and 2015. We now expect that share to fall to 5% between 2015 and 2021. Of course, there are different reasons why the production from this country decelerate. Of course, in Qatar is due to the moratorium on the expansion of the North Field and on further LNG construction. In Russia is very much due to the weakness of the domestic market and the weakness of its export markets, primarily Europe and the former Soviet Union countries, while for the ASEAN is very much due to I would say relatively low level of investment or insufficient investment in recent years to offset the natural decline of more mature fields. So, there are different reasons, but overall we are going to have this region to show relatively modest growth. At the same time, we have a surge in production from other regions, particularly Australia and the United States. One thing to point out is the vast majority of production increases in these two countries will actually go to feed exports. So because of the substantial deceleration in growth in US gas demand that I pointed to before, that relatively still healthy production growth expected from the United States will be much more skewed to serve other markets. Part of it, of course, will be Canada and Mexico, but a good chunk of it will be LNG market. So I think the US market will become much more sensitive to development in international markets, and production in the United States will start to have a closer link to development in international markets due to what that growth actually is going to feed. In Australia, it's quite obvious because we do have these 7 big projects which have either just started or are going to start production, and so much of that will be actually going to feed those new LNG projects. In the European Union, we expect the decline in production to continue, perhaps at a slightly lower pace, partly because of the very low level already of some of the North Sea production, and the assumption in this report that the Groningen production will continue at the most recent capped level. We recently have news that the government has planned a further potential reduction of 3 BCM. Of course, that is not included, but clearly signal that downside risks to that forecast are really possible. So zooming on the United States, which clearly is driving production growth, what do we expect on a more granular basis? I try to chart here the expectation of US gas production broken down by key producing region. So mainly you can see associated gas production, so gas which is basically produced in association for oil for some places which are drilled aiming at producing oil, and Marcellus and Utica, which clearly are the biggest wet and dry place in the country, and all the rest. And so we do expect stagnation in US gas production in 2016 due to the contraction in associated gas production linked to the substantial fall in oil production, which we do project through the year, and a substantial slowdown in production growth elsewhere, which is a consequence of very low gas prices. Gas prices in the US in the 2015 were at their lowest level since 1999. So clearly this has had an impact on the rate of investment in drilling. I would also point it out, however, that stagnation in production, given the level of contraction and the level of fall in investments and in drilling activity, is a testament to the remarkable resilience of the US shale gas industry, both from a technological perspective and from a financial perspective. Now, looking forward, because of the IEA forecasts of a gradual rebalancing of the oil market and gradual recovery in oil prices, we do expect associated gas production to return to the market from 2018 onwards and do much of the heavy lifting in terms of generating new production growth in the country. At the same time, we now are starting to see U.S. gas production tipping into decline. A period of very low prices is finally tightening up the supply side. And so these moderate price increases should be enough due to the substantial cost deflation that the industry has experienced to actually bring production back to growth from 2018 onwards. So we still expect production to increase by roughly 100 BCM in total between 2016 and 2021, and probably at prices which, of course, we don't forecast prices, but fundamental developments point to relatively moderate price increases due to falling costs on the one hand and the help of recovering oil prices in driving associated gas production growth. So what this is just to summarize the sort of year-to-year trend in growth that we are expecting from the United States. So what about Europe? I think it's one of the key messages when we do combine all this demand and production is that in Europe we will see a much more competitive price environment developing. Now this chart here shows is based on forward curves as of June 7th, and it just illustrates the price of TTF in 2013, 2015, and how the markets in that particular day were, let's say, I would say forecasting, but what was the price for delivery of TTF in 2017 versus what the forward curve prices for Henry Hub is was in June 7th, plus the transportation cost and the operational cost of an LNG terminals in the United States. So basically give you a sense of what the cash cost of shipping US into Europe currently is versus the price of gas in Europe. And that you can see that basically US gas looks competitive versus current gas prices in Europe on a pure cash cost basis. And so the reality that oversupplying global energy markets traditionally have resulted in Europe sucking in supply in the past. At a certain extent, this might indeed still happen, but clearly the extent to oversupply and the competitive pressure of the US supplies into Europe is a new dynamic that Europe will need to deal with. And our balances point to the need for current exporting into Europe to adopt more flexible pricing strategies if they do want to defend market share. In particularly, we know that Gazprom has stated many times in official documents, strategic documents, that is aiming at defending market share in Europe. So that will require some adjustments in the pricing strategy compared to a more fixed purely oil-linked basin pricing strategies that had prevailed from the company in the past. Still, we do expect, on average, around 30 BCM of LNG supplies to flow into Europe between incremental LNG supplies to flow into Europe between 2015 and 2021. So talking a little bit about global LNG markets, I already hinted to that, but we are clearly going to see a substantial increase in capacity over the next 5 years. So we expect actually capacity to increase by roughly 45% between 2015 and 2021, 190 BCM, which is a huge, massive amount. And because pretty much all the capacity is either underpinned by long-term capacity reservation contracts, primarily in the United States, or are at an advanced stage of development, the likelihood of substantial delays in the execution of these projects is actually very small. So by and large, we expect this capacity to be online by 2021. Of course, small delays and issues with project management and execution are always possible, but we don't expect the current low price and oil environment to have any substantial impact on the timeline of these projects due to the fact that much of the cost is already sunk. So much of it, as you can see from the picture, is expected to come from Australia and the United States. I think the size of the increase plus the additional so much flexible US LNG into the market will tend to create a much more interconnected LNG markets and start to develop a level of price connectivity, let's close it, across different regions. Now, more interesting to me at least, is where all this gas will go. Who is going to import? Okay, we know that there is all this capacity coming online. We know the demand is relatively weak. So where all this gas will go? So let's have a look at how import changes in imports look like for the period of 2009-2015 versus our forecast for the change in imports between 2015 and 2021. And we can quickly see that we expect substantial shift in trade patterns. So first of all, combined imports from Korea and Japan, which currently account for almost half of global LNG trade, will flatten at best or decline sharply at worst, depending on your own assumption of nuclear capacity. Given our 15 gigawatt capacity assumption, we have imports from these two countries declining substantially. This is a huge change compared to the period 2009-2015, where they actually accounted for 40% of the increase in global LNG trade and in global LNG imports. Now, Europe will take indeed more LNG. As I mentioned before, we forecast it to take around 30 BCM of additional LNG imports, but the capacity to absorb much more in addition to, on top of that 30 BCM, it's somewhat constrained by two things. On the one hand, still Russian gas supplies coming into Europe and the potential for competitive flows from Russia. And the second thing is weak demand and very low coal prices, which do limit the space the gas can actually capture in the power generation sector at sort of current price levels. Probably prices would need to fall substantially below current levels for a substantial amount of coal to gas switching to be unlocked on top of what is left due to the capacity closure, which in any case are going to occur due to environmental reasons. So we do have Europe coming with a substantial amount, but there is limits to how much it can actually add. Now, what about Latin America and Middle East, which are always looked at potential area of growth? I do think they do offer indeed important pockets of growth, but they can hardly be seen as a home destination for base load new supplies. They tend to be seasonal, they tend to be linked to developments on the hydropower in countries such as Brazil. So of course there will be pockets of growth, but we will not help that much in rebalancing, let's say, global LNG market. So it's clear that how fast global gas market rebalance will depend on the rate of strength of Chinese demand and developing Asian demand. And it's undeniable that this region has a huge demand growth potential. The question for me is, how can that potential be unlocked? And I think will certainly require substantial progress in market regulation, in environmental regulation, and in the build-out of physical infrastructure. Now, a period of low prices does have the potential for doing so, will substantially facilitate the task of all these three things to fall into place. But clearly is a huge risk factor. Now, in our forecast, we do assume and we do focus substantial acceleration in the level of intake of imports of both China and the rest of developing Asia. But I would also highlight how this is at the same time the key risk factor of the outlook. And assessing the price responsiveness of Asian demand is extremely difficult, and it should be seen as indeed one of the key things that could turn out different from what actually we are currently assuming in this outlook. Now, even with these assumptions, when we have China plus the rest of developing Asia taking an incremental 110 BCM of gas roughly, we do expect a utilization rate of the global LNG fleet to actually decline. Now, what we did with this slide was trying to estimate actual LNG capacity, which is different from nameplate capacity. So we took out of the forecast everything which is impacted by technical problems, like, for example, the Angola plants being out, or security issues such as the Yemeni LNG being out, and issues such as lack of feed gas, for example, in countries such as Algeria and Trinidad. So we just really looked at operational utilization of the existing fleet. And you can see how between 2011 and 2014, that was very high, around 95%, which makes sense given the relatively low operational cost of LNG plants, huge capital cost, so the tendency to operate plants as baseload facilities. To balance out the market, we expect the supply side will need to also contribute, basically, and we expect some lower utilization level due to economic reasons or the lack of demand, particularly in the period 2017-2018. Then we do expect the emergence of demand from gas market as new FSRU are put in place. A period of low oil prices do tend to attract new demand pockets in countries that before perhaps could not really afford that, to help to gradually rebalance the market. And of course the lack of new investments. But again, by 2021, in our baseline case, we don't really see the market to be back to the level of tightness that we did experience in the period 2011-2013. Although we do expect the market to start to show sign of improvements compared to the current level of oversupply. So I know that I painted a very bearish picture in a sort of an LNG-friendly market. So I like to highlight two things that I think need to be considered when looking at this baseline forecast. And we always need to, there is no crystal ball and no ability to forecast precisely the future. So we need to consider what could be wrong, what could have missed in forecasting this picture. I think one is, we did experience in the past a trend of an increasing trend of capacity being offline. So this chart shows what, how much liquefaction capacity has been offline between 2011 and 2015 due to a series of different issues. And you can see the trend is very clear. Actually, it's tripled between 2011 and 2015. And this has occurred in a period of very high oil and gas prices. So I think the chance for something to go wrong and for some supply to be off market in an environment of low oil and gas prices is actually increasing rather than decreasing. So of course we can all start to look at, okay, Angola now is back and Yemen maybe is back, but that doesn't in the broader picture, if we do look at the broader trend, doesn't change the overall dynamics. And I think if we do look at the next 5 years, we should really wonder whether some contingency should actually be placed when looking at forecasts for global capacity additions and incremental supplies. The other things to consider is around investments. And I try to combine a picture showing how much capacity has received FIDs on average over the previous few years. Between 2011 and 2014, around 35 BCM has taken FIDs every year. 2015 already showed a slowdown. We were around 25 BCM, but much of the capacity that was FID in 2015 was done on the back of contracts, binding contracts signed well ahead of 2015. So the key impact of the very low oil and gas prices from the second half of 2014 is not fully captured in 2015, but it is fully captured in 2016, when in fact we did not really see any new FID till beginning of June. So of course there is a chance for something to occur in the second half of the year, but the fall in investment it's so far been drastic. And so these open questions on how markets might look like, probably post 2021 due to the time lag in bringing new projects online, but I think it's an important question that buyers and sellers should ask themselves when looking at long-term market developments. And so this, I think, was my last slide. So very quick chart just to wrap up. So the gas landscape is changing. Production growth is increasingly driven by the US and Australia, and that growth is increasingly linked to exports rather than feeding domestic markets. At the same time, demand growth it's really and increasingly led by developing Asia. Traditional exporters will come under pressure as competition will increase from new supply sources. I talked specifically about the European case, but I think this is very true outside Europe as well. If we do think about pressure for renegotiating contracts or for changing sort of contract structure and to introduce more flexibility in LNG contracts as well. Global gas prices are set to stay under pressure as a huge amount of capacity is coming to the market. Of course, we still expect a linkage to oil prices to remain from over the next 5 years. So if oil prices recover, it's very likely the Asian gas prices will recover as well. But I think there will be an increasing pressure for the linkage to weaken. And when we talk about global spot gas prices rather than average prices in importing regions, there will be a tendency for the sort of discounts and the pressure of spot prices versus oil link prices to increase, as we will have more flexible non-oil linked supplies coming into the market. And then, of course, lower prices have triggered a collapse in new investment. And this does raise questions on, are we going to see the consequences of that collapse in the next decade, and how the industry should react or should prepare itself for not the next 5 years, but let's say the next 15 or 20. So this was all from me. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to have your questions now.
Okay, thank you, Costanza, for your clear explanation about production, suppliers, all the thing, and prices and markets. This is a time, as she said, about a question for her, if you would like to have someone.
You can ask in Spanish, huh? And
You can ask
either I'll
Spanish.
try to understand or I will get it translated anyway.
You can answer in Spanish or English.
I can answer, you can translate.
Okay, give him the micro. You can give your name and your work, your job, company or...
Juan Sanchez, Head of Market Analysis of Enagas. Thank you, Costanza, for your excellent presentation. I have two questions, if I may. One is related to coal-to-gas switching in Europe. You said that to see coal-to-gas switching in Europe, in continental Europe, not UK, we have to see prices going substantially lower than current levels. So what is the level you see in this regard? Is it below or above cash costs of US LNG? Because I mean, if it is below, then we will see probably before liquefaction capacity in US switching out. But if it is above, then you can imagine a scenario where, I mean, with Asian demand growing slower than expected, and a lot of LNG going to Europe, not only US but also Qatar and so on, that has much lower cash costs than the US, and Russia defending market share, then you can see a potential coal-to-gas switching in Europe. And so which is the level and what is the potential in terms of demand growth? And the other question has to do with these demand pockets you mentioned on regions like LATAM and so on. It seems you didn't give a lot of importance to that, but my question is, do you see for example, the FSRUs emerging trend, which are being installed in new importing countries quite rapidly? Do you see this trend as a potential, I mean, making the sum of these demand pockets getting more and more relevance? Because if I'm not wrong, there are kind of between 20 and 30 FSRUs right now being developed, and this can make a difference in terms of demand.
A very excellent question. So regarding the first, it's something I spent a lot of time to look into, and it's a difficult one because it's the switching level is a moving target, because basically depends by a lot of different factors, but predominantly coal prices in Europe and US gas price in the US. So as these two moves, then of course that switching level also move. You could argue that with oil prices expected to recover, that might somewhat impact coal prices as well. I would say that bearing extreme cases is going to be easier to get below the cost of transporting US gas into Europe first. And so once I was doing this analysis, so oil prices were a little bit lower, I think much of the switching corridor in Europe was assessed at the price between 9 and 11 euro per megawatt hour. So we probably are talking of somewhere below $3 per million BTU. And so at this level, even with remarkably low gas price in the US, you just start to see the economics impacted. At the same time, I think we always try to simplify our analysis. So we talk about one level, one US gas prices, and one simplified formula. The reality that we don't really know for sure how much in the US gas transportation chain is actually fixed cost. So you might have chartered things, you might have long-term regasification capacity contract. So how much of the regasification fee, how much of the freight is a sunk cost, and how much is a variable cash cost, I think it's probably not set in stone. So I wouldn't be surprised to see, of course, some fluctuations in demand, or demand developing, or cargoes moving, even when the very simplified calculation that me and you can probably show or talk about suggest that nothing should move. At the same time, similar story for the level of coal to gas switching. I mean, efficiency of coal plants in Europe are very different. So, you know, of course, it's not a flat line, but it's a moving, moving line. So we start to switch the most older plants, and then we go forward. So I don't think there is one point, but I would say if I need to summarize and oversimplify my answer to you, I would say I see more chances to hit cost of transporting US into Europe before we actually get to the point where it makes sense to switch. Regarding the FSRU, I absolutely agree with you that FSRU will keep growing, and in fact, lower oil and gas prices will open up new market. And in my view, much of that will actually occur in developing Asia. So, you know, we are seeing some of that already occurring, and there are many countries which, because of the much lower cost of gas, they now have the possibility from a economic standpoint to actually import gas. I think, however, sometimes it's a little bit every single experience is different. I think everybody has now in mind two countries, mainly Pakistan. The experience of Pakistan, everybody has that in mind, which is great. But Pakistan is also a country which has a very well-developed gas infrastructure, has an underutilized power fleet, so has already sort of a sunk infrastructure cost also on the downstream chain because of the substantial, was a substantial gas producer. So repeating the experience of Pakistan in other countries might not be equally easy if you do not have the power fleet already built, if you don't have the grid already built, and if the country does not have the level of infrastructure development that Pakistan had. And even with a country like Pakistan, the fact that you have XX amount of BCM of new FSRU being built doesn't mean that you will have XX amount of BCM of new imports. It's a matter of contracts, and it's a matter of pricing as well for the portion which might be tendered and not built under contract, depending on the level of spot price at the time, that will make a big difference. And I think the market is also facing really a shift from what all producers were happy with, which is having secure, price-insensitive, baseload demand from credit-worthy counterparts, such as Japan and Korea. And now we're moving versus smaller pocket of growth from more risky counterparts, which are massively price sensitive. And so, yes, the FSRU, the facility will be there, but I'm not 100% sure that everything will be, actually utilized. And even if it's so, if you do look at the demand that you're losing from the established consumers versus the FSRU and demand that you're bringing, it's just not enough to bring you into balance. Very quickly, just about Latin America and the Middle East, I think one thing that skews the picture a lot is Brazil in our forecast, because if we do start to see, first of all, demand is going to be very weak given what the country is facing. At the same time, the substantial growing LNG intake that Brazil did see over the past few years was mainly due to the collapse in hydro generation. So with hydro improving, with winds also coming onto Brazil and very weak generation growth, chances are the Brazilian LNG intakes will actually decline. So even if we do assume more Argentina, more Chile, and more Emirates, you start to see difficulties in ramping those up to the point where Brazil, which was indeed a big LNG importer, get offset.
Okay. Some more question to Costanza. Let me ask a final question to you. Yes. With this situation of the gas market, with the flooding of the LNG or the market, are we going to see more decoupling between the price and oil and gas?
That's a very interesting question. I would define Not because I don't want to answer your question, because it's a complicated, the answer is complicated to the question, in my view, because we need to think about why, first of all, we did see so much convergence in prices over the past year and a half. And I think there are two reasons. One is, of course, the oversupply situation of the market. So when you are in a market which is oversupplied, it's absolutely normal that you start to trade based on marginal costs and marginal transportation costs. So it's not what a destination market is happy to pay that will determine the spread, but is what the transportation costs across region actually are. So the fact that spreads have collapsed make perfect fundamental sense. By the way, that's also the way the US gas market trade, if you think about the basis spreads across regions, is absolutely normal based on transportation cost. In the gas markets, this process has been facilitated by another thing, which has been we have a very rare or unusual alignment between gas fundamentals and oil fundamentals, which there is no reason why that should be there all the time. So as oil markets were really oversupplied, oil prices collapsed, and this has allowed oil-linked prices to trade pretty much at the same level where spot gas prices were trading and where fundamental gas markets were probably clearing. So we did have the collapse in oil prices to really accentuate the tendency towards convergence that the oversupply of the gas market was leading us towards. Looking forward, because, and of course everybody can have different expectations about the outlook for oil prices, and we don't know where oil prices will go. But if we do assume, as the IEA does, that oil market will gradually tighten and oil prices will gradually recover, that tendency will move the other direction. And so I think what we will see is an increased tendency towards disconnection between spot gas prices and oil-linked prices, an increased tendency for the spread between oil-linked prices, spot prices to widen, and increased pressure for producers and consumers clearly on should we have oil-linked prices or should we have spot gas prices. The tension is pretty much gone over the previous year and a half, but I think we will resume as we move towards 2020, 2021. I don't know if this answer satisfies you.
A crystal ball, no? A little bit a crystal
But I
ball.
hope it does.
Okay, some more questions you have, or just one here? Please, no, you have the micro there.
Álvaro Pérez, Noxel, Spain, Business Development. Well, we are a pipe manufacturer, and we recognize perfectly the graphs you have shown us, because the drop in investments in projects regarding gas is huge. Nowadays, we experience an increase in hydro, but in gas, we have seen a huge fall in investments. Don't you foresee for the future, regarding European Union projects, an increase in investments to guarantee the gas supply, taking into account that nowadays we have a huge dependency on the gas from Russia, and also taking into account the political instability that we have nowadays?
Yeah, that's interesting, because it's a perspective in terms of infrastructure rather than quantities. Certainly, we have seen since 2009 a substantial, I would say, improvement in the degree of connectivity between various European markets and various European regions. I think that connectivity, that degree, will indeed continue to increase. There is a number of projects of common interest and a number of potential terminals or connections that we will be built for diversification of supply purposes mainly, exactly. So that might be a good news, sure, for your business, but I hardly see that as being the silver lining in markets which do experience such a collapse at a global level in investments. So surely something that you should consider to capture, but talking from a macro perspective, I don't think that will be changing in any way the overall, or skew massively the overall level of investments. Also to consider the fact that in fact that sort of dynamic has already been in place over the past 5 years. In fact, I would say much has been done between 2009 and 2015 already. So that might continue, but might well not accelerate further.
Okay. Something more, or this is the end? I think you can download this presentation from our web, and you can take the resume over there outside, okay? Thank you, Costanza, for coming.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the attention.
For us having you here, and an applause for her, okay?
Thank you.